Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Welcome to the second forum for a partnership for uncertain times. I'm your host for the session today. My name is Jessica Alice. I'm a poet and a critic and writer, and I'm the CEO of Writers SA, the State Writers Centre. I would like to acknowledge that we're all gathering on sovereign, unceded Aboriginal land and acknowledge that colonisation was a process, or is a process that is ongoing, that this is country that has held people telling stories, making art, sharing knowledge, doing science for millennia, and will continue to do so. It always was, always will be Aboriginal land, and it really is a pleasure for us to be able to gather in a spirit that continues some of those traditions today. I will start with giving you a little bit of information about how today is going to work. For those of you who haven't been to one of these forums before, we have a great honour to hear from 4 exceptional artists who have been working on this project. Brad DARKSON, Catherine TRUMAN, Deirdre Feeney, and NIKI SPEROU. They'll be showing you some work that they've been working on. And as you know, with this project, they will be showing you works in progress of works in progress. The curatorial premise of this project is uncertainty, but they're also working in the medium of creative research and practice, and the practice itself is the work. So I think there's something very generous that you're getting there from the artists. And we'll be thinking about this topic of uncertainty and this idea of process in everything from the fact that we're living in a post-pandemic world. We're also living under an ongoing colonial project. We're living in an unstable economy, a climate that's been ravaged by humanity and capitalism. And at an anatomic level, subatomic level, we know that uncertainty is one of the very basic foundations of the universe. So we've got incredibly rich subject matter that we'll be looking at today. We will hear from each of the artists in just a moment, and then we'll move into a Q&A portion. I'm just going to give you some hot tips for this Zoom webinar. Your microphones are switched off, so we won't be speaking from the audience. We do have some pre-submitted questions that you've sent in prior to today that we will be directing to the artists. And you'll also have the opportunity to engage in conversation through the Q&A function. So you can type questions into the Q&A chat there. The event is being recorded. It'll be shared with Click Films for partial incorporation into a SpectraVision episode. And I'd like to shout out to the ANAT team behind the scenes, Melissa Delaney, Jen Brazier, Carolyn Kavanagh, Asoph Widdistow, and with tech support from Michelle Wigg. So thank you all. I think that's it. I will, and to give you a visual description of myself, I'm a white woman with blonde hair wearing a black jumper. So you know who's speaking. All right, it is a real pleasure to introduce our first artist for today's session, Brad DARKSON. Brad is a South Australian visual artist currently working across various media, including carving, sound, sculpture, multimedia installation, and painting. Brad's practice is regularly focused on site-specific works and connections between contemporary and traditional cultural practice, language, and law. His current research interests include hostile architecture, bureaucracy, seaweed, and the neo-capitalist hellhole we are all forced to exist within. Conceptually, Brad's work is often informed by his First Nations and Anglo-Australian heritage. Brad's mob is Narungga, and he is a proud member of the Chester family. Over to you, Brad.
Thank Thanks, Jessica. So I'd just like to start by first acknowledging that I'm calling in from Ghana country, and I want to pay respects to my aunties and elders. It's important that I acknowledge them and all elders past and present. Just quickly, my preferred pronouns are he, him. A visual description of me is that I'm wearing a red beanie with an Aboriginal flag on it in the middle, and Narunga is written above it. I got that beanie a long time ago, and it's one of my favorites. Has little melted bits in it from being around the campfire, and it smells like smoke from some of the stuff that I'll talk about throughout this project. I'm wearing a black and white jacket and a black hoodie. I thought I'd begin with a brief example from my practice. And so I'll just start sharing my screen now to begin my presentation. So just to tie this presentation in with some context for the current work that I've been doing with this uncertainty project, because the theme very much is process focused for me with this project. This image is just a quick shot of the country that I'm calling in from, and I was lucky enough to be walking down there this morning talking about some other stuff that I'm working on with seaweed and Ghana First Nations focused projects in caring for country and the ocean. So what does process mean to me in the context of my broader practice? For me, collaboration is intrinsic in process, maybe not in the traditional sense of what a collaborative arrangement could mean, say between multiple artists or an artist and someone from outside the arts working together on a shared project, but I tend to consider my practice to be inherently collaborative for reasons I'll expand upon in a minute. So here's an example of one of my previous works titled Smart Object that I'll just talk about briefly to illustrate the common thread of collaboration as process. This work was developed over a long period of time and involved significant consultation with community. And when I'm referring to community, I'm talking about community with a capital C, which for me refers to First Nations people in my community. In the more traditional sense of collaborating, I worked with multiple animators to develop the animated component of the work, a looping animation of my virtual self carving a traditional plongi or club in a motion capture studio. While in the less traditional sense of the word collaboration, I was literally carving a plongi, continually speaking with elders and others in community to enable me to learn culture and present culture to a broader audience. In spending time yarning with elders and members of community, my cultural knowledge is being improved. My spirit is being cared for. My obligation to community and country is being met. And that obligation and responsibility is something that I refer to as standpoint. I consider this type of interaction to be collaborative from an intergenerational and cultural perspective, and I'll expand on this in a little bit. So some plongis and other carved objects are sung to, with the understanding that there is a spirit within the materiality of that object. The most meaningful part of that project for me was the time I got to spend with Uncle Moogie and others sitting and carving, talking about cultural practice, talking about language and family, and listening to stories from elders. And this aspect of my practice can be described as yarning as research. The act of yarning is not just a means for communicating, but an intrinsic part of continuing culture. It encompasses a broader system of beliefs and a holistic worldview. The broader cultural context that the work is situated within stems from tens of thousands of years of unbroken oral tradition. Oral tradition. The context is also anti-colonial, anti-capitalist, and anti-extractive, with a conceptual framework that is circular and built from the understanding that ultimately everything connects. And the actual plongy was presented alongside the virtual carving to juxtapose the quest for sentience in artificial intelligence with the opportunity in front of us to reconnect with the natural world that surrounds us and the objects within that natural world. So with this project, I've carried forward the context of collaboration as process, initially beginning as an exploration of analog sound and heat. The conceptual underpinning for my project has been deeply rooted in the cultural practice of traditional land management through applying fire to country. Over the past year, I've been working as part of the Ghana Fire team to care for country using fire to regenerate land and reconnect our traditions to the spirit of the land. For me, that means that when I'm carrying out these traditional land management practices and practicing culture, what I'm doing is not only caring for the physical or biological aspects of the land, but what I'm really doing is caring for country as a whole. And when I say country as a whole, I'm referring to all living things in that landscape: animals, plants, rivers, oceans, skies, of course, people. I'm caring for me and I'm caring for my family. One of the most important things to remember when considering this holistic worldview is that it's not just about stating that humans are part of the environment. It's about understanding that humans have an active role to play with pollination or caring for grasses or all of those other land management roles that promote foods and the health of the land. You know, just like bees and ants and other insects, they have their role to play, or how fungi or maggots have a role in biodegradation. You know, humans have a role in clearing excessive amounts of biological matter from our grasslands and promoting growth of our native species through fire, through combustion, heat, and smoke. The bush is a colonial construct. These dense areas of scrub that have come to define the national psyche in this continent are in fact unmanaged and neglected parts of our environment. Because our traditional land management practices were outlawed by a colonizer a long time ago and are still outlawed today. When we clear the land and apply the right fire, the cool fire to the land, we are bringing back our traditional food sources, we're accessing cultural materials, we are maintaining our cultural sites. When we're walking together on country and applying fire to the land, we're listening to the land, the wind, to the plants, to the fire, and to each other. And this is where the intersection of collaboration and process is found within my project. Going back to my earlier point on collaboration, this is where the intergenerational aspect becomes central to how I feel about collaboration as process within my arts practice. I have an obligation, sorry, that was my son. I have an obligation to my ancestors, to my elders, to myself, and to the next generation. An obligation and responsibility. That's my standpoint. That's my worldview that's been passed down to me. An obligation and responsibility to learn and practice my culture. In order to understand my culture and my active role in the broader environment as a cultural practitioner, I need to first listen to elders, listen to the environment. This is a standpoint or worldview that's been passed down to me and my family and my elders and my ancestors for over 1,000 generations before me, in complex and carefully managed social structures that place country and caring for country at the center, because we are country. In this project, while I've been documenting and reflecting on my experience working in the Ghana Fire team, I've been experimenting with ways to create sound with sources of heat through the use of electronic components such as thermoelectric generators and analog synthesis. I've been exploring ways to create various sounds using voltages that are generated and influenced by temperature and light variations. And the intention behind this experimentation is to work towards creating sounds that rely on a heat source. And conceptually, this links with traditional land management practices, where in order to maintain culture and the health of country, fire needs to be actively maintained and tended to. Throughout this project, I've sought advice and help from multiple people, including analog synthesizer enthusiasts and electrical engineering experts. And I consider these conversations to be insightful, valuable, and important to move the project forward. And I'm grateful to all the people who have assisted me. but I don't necessarily consider these conversations to be intrinsically collaborative. They may be conversations that lead to collaborative projects, but these people don't inherently become collaborators within my definition of collaboration as process. These interactions are more akin to an extractive or transactional worldview. Whereas, on the other hand, any conversation I have on the phone when I call one of my aunties is inherently collaborative. It's me listening. I'm listening to my elders, waiting for them to choose the right moment to impart knowledge. For me, these conversations are not extractive or transactional. Sometimes they are helpful for moving a project forward, and sometimes they are not. But they are all conversations that enable me to learn and practice culture. When I leave the studio at the end of the day, or a project comes to an end, the process always continues at home, in the car, in my spirit, and in my heart. And whether that leads to an artwork or to land management, or whether it leads to me being able to do the same for subsequent generations, it is all interconnected. This project may cease at the end of the exhibition we're working towards, but my collaboration as process cannot.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brad. That was so good to see what you've been working on and to hear about the many ways that you've been considering process, collaboration, maintenance, process, all of these things. Wonderful. Thank you. The next artist that we're going to hear from is Catherine TRUMAN. Catherine is an established South Australian artist working across the disciplines of art and science. Catherine's practice is renowned for its diversity and depth and incorporates objects, contemporary jewellery, digital imagery, film and installation works with a focus upon the parallels between artistic practice and scientific method. During 2022, Catherine is an artist in residence at Carrick Hill, undertaking a project titled The Arrangements Assembling Nature. Catherine's work has been exhibited nationally and internationally. Over to you, Catherine.
Thank you. Thanks very much. What a pleasure it is actually to hear my, well, I was going to call you all collaborators, and you are collaborators in this project, I think. But thank you, Brad. Clearly, we need to collaborate more. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge too that I live and work on Kaurna land and pay my deep respects to elders past, present and emerging. My preferred pronouns are she, her, and I am a woman with short grain brown hair, red rimmed glasses, and I'm wearing an orange shirt with a purple and blue brooch and a red scarf. How's that for detail? I'm just going to share my screen with you straight away. And to begin with, I'd really like to provide some context for the work that I'm doing for a partnership for uncertain times, and tell you about a residency that I've undertaken recently at Carrick Hill, which is a unique estate nestled in the foothills of Adelaide. Carrick Hill covers about 100 acres, and it includes an English-style manor house built in 1939, and it's surrounded by an extensive cultivated garden and a rim of remnant endangered grey box grassy woodland. So the house itself is only 84 years young, and it's sited on land that's billions of years old. It's a place where the reality of geological time, First Nations custodianship, colonisation, and contemporary life can be encountered at once. My research here has been focused on the historical and contemporary relationships between humans and the plant world, particularly the ways we assemble and organise the natural world. And it's culminated in an exhibition called The Arrangements Assembling Nature, which is currently on show within the House Museum itself. This residency at Carrick Hill left me with a sense that nothing remains undisturbed, and an overwhelming sense that the natural world is now more distanced from our lives and understanding than ever before. This potent landscape is like a microcosm of the wider world, and it's provided the focus for a partnership for uncertain times. My new project is called The Taken Path. It's a speculative and durational project that hangs off a poetic idea, a simple question. What would I notice if I walked the same path once a month over the course of a year? So the project revolves around this repetitive action of walking and filming a defined path once a month over the course of a year, and it means that I accept whatever environmental conditions are present. The path itself is a prominent path which bisects the Carrick-Hill estate, which you can see here on the image, and it traverses both highly managed gardens, informal plantings, and remnant bush. One way to the northwest ends at a single pencil pine, and the opposite end to the southeast leads to a massive old grey box eucalypt. In the very centre sits the stone house. After 10 months into the project, I can say that The Taken Path is an open-ended experiment in observation and embodied experience. I'm a keen collaborator. So key to this project is my collaboration with Ian Gibbons. He's an emeritus professor of anatomy, he's a neuroscientist, and now a renowned video poet. As a scientist, Ian brings a different perspective and approach to the project, and I'll talk more about this richness of a collaborative approach a bit later. The structure and process we've adopted for this project involved randomly choosing a day and a time each month to film the path using 2 devices, a video camera and an iPhone. We walk the centre of the path, holding the devices in the same way at chest height each time, capturing whatever conditions are present. These films are the control films and provide the raw material. The control films act as valuable points of comparison over time. And I'm just going to show you now a short clip of some raw footage from the Eastern Path, coming through a pleached pear arbour. And it's kind of recent, May, autumn. It's in the autumn time. We're about to head out now through the archway in a very established 84-year-old hedge. And as we come out, at the very end of this path, you can see the pencil pine. So critical to the project is the time in between the film shoots where Ian and I meet to review the footage. We get together on a regular basis, and that means that we can reflect on our individual experiences of the shoot and build on the dialogue centred on these observations. We use this time to generate ideas and propose experiments to inform the next shoot. Remaining as open as possible, not focusing on neatly tied up artworks or conclusions, means that this is a very generative approach. And it's a generative approach to process that has already provided years' worth of raw material. To date, this process has generated many experimental films, and as well as ideas for the development of a series of wearable glass objects that explore the themes of dislocation and separation. I formed a collaboration also with Liam Fleming, a glass artist, to develop these kinds of glass works. So they're really works in progress at this time. And I'm just going to flick through some experimental images and film stills that have come from the project as I talk further. In the development of The Taken Path, I was highly aware that I wanted to approach this as an open-ended experiment, which is a rare opportunity in a full-time arts practice. I was also aware that collaboration brings a rich depth to a project and provides the opportunity to bring new perspectives and voices. Ian and I have a long history of collaboration, and the established trust and respect that were built up over some time has enabled us to accelerate the scope and the capacity of this particular project. I believe it's critical for artists and scientists alike to continually confront the conventions of our work in order to build a diverse and meaningful practice. Uncertainty and challenge are part and parcel of being alive. The Taken Path project is essentially about how we observe and engage with the world around us and what we can learn from being observant and present to it. We've noticed many things. How the same ground sounds different in the wet and the dry. How seasonal flocks of birds are. How much machinery is part of these altered landscapes. The infinitesimal shifts in the density of the soil under our feet, and the incredible tenacity and fragility of the endemic and introduced vegetation over time, and especially the unnerving blurring of the seasons. There's been a conscious strategy to pare back, to strip back all that gets in the way of embodied experience of filming the path, minimising the structure and the rules to let the new language emerge. The simple repetitive act of walking and filming the path has built a strong scaffold, strong enough to support an incredible weight of inquiry. What has become clear is that in these uncertain times, a more inclusive, cross-generational, cross-cultural exchange between people of all fields of knowledge is becoming more critical to our survival in these very uncertain times. So what's left? We still have a few months left of the project, but in the wash-up so far, I can say that I think both Ian and I have expanded our own processes of observation and engagement and have become acutely aware of the ways in which humans ironically distance themselves from and disturb the very land they hold close. The taken path can be interpreted as a path taken, walked and filmed. It can also be interpreted as a path cultivated, structured, disturbed, disrupted and invaded, and a potent symbol of human industry. So I feel there's a lot more to come. And I've already begun to think of this project as stage one of an ongoing, open-ended inquiry. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. So wonderful to see the work as it's developing, and also those meditations on deep listening and noticing.
Thank you.
Thank you. The next artist we'll hear from is NIKI SPEROU. NIKI is a South Australian artist with a long-standing engagement within the nexus of art, science and culture. Since 2016, she's been the resident artist at the Department of Medical Biotechnology at Flinders University. And her interest in contemporary innovations in technology, the body, and her cultural background have led to her to draw parallels between the biotechnology and ancient Greek cultural paradigms. For SPEROU, these connections emerge in chimerical forms and concepts. Welcome, NIKI.
Hi, thanks for having me. I've been enjoying the speakers up to now, and I'm really enjoying the parallels between the different works. So that's been something I think I'll contemplate as I leave the end of the day, but I'll just start sharing my PowerPoint. Does it come up?
Not yet.
I don't know why it's not coming. I'm doing exactly what I did before. Just go out and try again.
Are you sharing your screen, Nikki?
Yeah, I am. I'll go to this one and see if that. Oh, goodness me. Doing exactly what I did earlier. Maybe can we go to Deirdre while I work it out? Oh, goodness.
Sure. Okay. We will. All right. We'll come.
Oh, sorry, I'm here.
Got it.
I did the same thing. I don't know. Sorry. Okay. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of Kaurna land and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. I'm NIKI SPEROU. I go by the pronouns she, her. I'm a mature woman with olive skin, wavy hair, and I'm wearing a green marble dress. The title of my work in progress is Mesh Interspecies Empathy. We live in uncertain times, and uncertainty drives us to take risks, generate new viewpoints and questions. And as an emerging artist, I was initially interested in new technologies and how they changed what it meant to be human. However, my interest has evolved to include other voices, post-human, queer, transdisciplinary and post-colonial. And now I feel that the better question is something that's posed to us from Hannah Langdecker, and that is, what does it mean to be biological? Working with life as a medium evokes questions about relationships. So life depends on complex systems for support. I'm seeking empathetic relationships to heal wounds. For well over 20 years, I've worked in the nexus of art and science, and actually it's been since 2006 that I've been the artist in residence at the Department of Medical Biotechnology at Flinders University, 17 years. And my process is the manipulation of live media in an art context. My palette is skin, fat, flesh, blood, and chlorophyll. My practice fits within the genre of bioart, in which artists work with wet biology and the technologies used to manipulate it. Working with living entities is always uncertain, as they have their own agency and sometimes perform in unexpected ways. They can resist our interventions. But although this is challenging, I also find it extremely fascinating. I also question the politics of manipulating life, the ethics, and rather than illustrating the science, I'm interested in making interdisciplinary work that reframes, blends, and repurposes. I make connections with other voices to reframe technology, coexistence, spirituality, and to facilitate a type of healing at this time of uncertainty. According to Sandra Harding, we all work from our own standpoints, our place in structures of power, identity, discipline, and ontology, and interdisciplinary practice allows for difference and risk. For over 20 years, I've been making fanciful chimeras. Chimeras are hybrid entities that pertain to myths, metaphors, and corporeal realities. Chimeras reflect the complexity of uncertain times and a future that's hard to grasp. So what's the dialogue now? What's the historical context of a medium that we work with? What are its applications or actions? How do we subvert the powers who wrote the history, and how do we look forward? How do we respond to crises, and how can we be more mindful of our actions? How do we balance aesthetics and ethics? And what does it mean to be human given our manifold identity? Also, I ask, is an anthropocentric view still valid from the perspectives of Indigenous cultures, feminist and non-human organisms, we might ask, whose Anthropocene is it? A long-standing approach to my work has been to fuse contemporary biotechnologies and ancient Greek paradigms, innovations and traditions. In Greek culture, we say when we're trying to define the undefinable that we're chasing chimeras. So my aim is to decolonize culture, to be inclusive and subvert privilege of human over non-human. And I think we also need to consider the hierarchies imposed on life and the boundaries between disciplines. The reframing of ancient authorities, I'll be discussing again in this presentation. I also facilitate workshops to demystify science and create dialogue. In 2013, in Winnipeg, Canada, I met one of my collaborators for Uncertainty, performance artist and religious mythmaker M. Deirdre. M participated in my bioart workshop, Zones of Inhibitions, and he said that he always felt an outsider to science, but participation in the workshop brought a type of healing for him. He felt that he was invited into the fold. In 2020, I undertook a Synapse residency with the Centre for Marine Bioproducts Development, and we were researching marine biopolymers as alternative to petroleum-based plastics. The collaboration produced a feedback loop that drove investigations into new science and art endeavours. Biotechnologist Peng Su and I developed a leather for Deirdre, who wanted to bind a religious book with their own skin. I've been interested in rejuvenation technologies for quite a while, and I suggested that we produce an algal polymer, skin-like leather, that could be seeded with Deirdre's cells. And in this work, I've repurposed the leather we created for Deirdre to make a crisis mask. Crisis mask address two current crises, the pandemics and the plastics pollution problem. And also extending upon my long-standing interest in skin, Sue and I experimented with the same marine algal polymer for wound healing films. And okay, so why are we looking for plastic alternatives? Who are we doing this for? For plastics, Memento Mori, the artwork here, I utilize a vanitas aesthetic to invoke non-human empathy because of the plastics problem. For uncertain times, I've been researching interspecies subjectivity, vulnerability, and empathy. At the ANAT 2020 Spectra conference, I was asked if I considered the living organisms that I manipulated to be collaborators in my work. And well, that depends on your definition of collaboration. I think there's a problem of speaking for others, and this problem's quite difficult to resolve. And let's consider what matters to animals and who's doing the talking. What we have in common with other species, and this is something that I've observed when I work with life, is that we all have the ability to thrive and suffer, and life is temporal. When manipulated living organisms, scientists tend to distance themselves from their subject so that emotion does not interfere with their research. Apparently, it's a thing. The artwork we're looking at is informed by scientific dominion over bodies, in this case, women's bodies, but also extends to others. Science has a history of objectivity and indifference to the disorderly scenes of pain and death. According to William Harvey, 1653, the deliberate dampening of one's thoughts and feelings during experimentation heightened one's ability to perceive the natural world, to read a seemingly irregular world anew. My aim is to critique power dynamics, practices that have historically enacted violence on peoples, animals, and environment, again, with a view to a healing. I've used symbols here to distance the viewer from images that might confront. These veiled images of my surgery reference ritualistic religious vestments. Science is a ritualistic practice, and like religion, relies on ordered ways of being. Weaving into science's ritual is Skin Bible, the collaboration with Michael Dudek, and myself. The project centres upon a transgressive artefact skin Bible bound in a laboratory-produced skin-like polymer seeded with Dudek cells. It's proposed that Skin Bible will be illuminated in a virtual reality performance. So that's something that we'll be working towards in the future. My Skin Bible, the Skin Bible builds upon Dudek's fictional queer space opera, Religion Virus, and my reflection upon biotechnology, ancient Greek narrative, sciences, ritual, and chimeras. And the collaboration extends upon religious myth-making and speculative futures. Deirdre and I have been working together in the lab. We prepared the parchment and used the protocol that Peng Su and I devised during the Synapse residency. The two projects informed each other. Skin Bible fed into the science with the production of vegan leathers, wound healing films, polymers, cell scaffolds, and a personal lubricant. Earlier, I spoke about reframing ancient authorities. Both Deirdre and I mesh past and future into chimeras of meaning across time. Deirdre reinterprets archaeological sites to reconstruct mythologies. Together, we perform these mythologies. Our recent interventions are transported to the ancient site of Scatterbrae in Scotland. In uncertain times, I believe it's of consequence to mesh voices of science, culture, and mythical speculation to question the uncertainties of life, technology, coexistence, and spirituality. My process is to reframe the past in order to heal the future. And I'd like to thank all the people that I collaborated with during my process. Thanks to everyone at ANAT, thanks to UniSA, big thanks to Deirdre Feeney, and thanks to Department of Medical Biotechnology and Centre for Marine Bioproducts, Alice Gorman at Archaeology at Flinders, of course to M. Dudek and the Ansible Space Institute, Click Films Taylor, who came and took fantastic images. Thanks, Jessica, for today. And thanks to the Xiaoling Su Functional Materials Group, where Taylor and I had some photos taken, and of course to John, Brad, Catherine, and Deirdre. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Nikki. Oh, you might need to, oh yeah, we're good. So interesting to see all of the materials, mediums that you're working in. Thank you. Our next artist to present is Deirdre Feeney. Deirdre is an artist and lecturer of contemporary art at UniSA. As part of her creative practice, Deirdre researches and develops optical image systems as perceptual tools for generating wonder and awareness of technologically mediated experience. Deirdre engages in cross-disciplinary collaboration with scientists and engineers to explore and realize her artworks. In 2020 and 2021, she undertook a Museum of Arts and Applied Sciences Fellowship and ANAT Synapse residency, and her background in glassmaking and the projected moving image were pivotal to her current practice, encompassing material and digital methods to create her own optical image systems. And Deirdre's work has been exhibited nationally and internationally. Thank you, Deirdre.
Thank you very much, Jessica. And thank you also to Brad, Catherine, and Nikki for this really just highly engaging presentations. They're amazing. So I'm just going to share my screen. So I guess just to share as well, so I've got a dual role in the project, a partnership for uncertain times, because as well as being one of the project artists, I'm also one of the instigators and organizers of the collaboration between UniSA and ANAT. So firstly, I would like to acknowledge the traditional Garna custodians of the land on which I'm presenting today. And in particular, I want to acknowledge their long time and rich systems of knowing, and really their sensitivity in how they listen to and care for country and culture. So my preferred pronouns are she and her. And for members of the audience who are visually impaired, I'm a white female with brown curly hair that I'm wearing in a ponytail today. And I've got a cream jumper on with a silvery gray scarf with some blue and red speckles. So because the Partnership for Uncertain Times engaged the artist to work with experimental process rather than finished artworks, and also because the project is still in progress, I'm going to share different aspects of my process within my project, Perceptual Illusions. So my project is an inquiry into how we perceive depth of fields in materially generated optical images. And more broadly, my practice develops optical image systems where I reveal the mechanism generating the image. And I guess I do this with the aim of bringing attention to the process of how we perceive technologically mediated images, which I term optical fictions. So in a way, my practice endeavors to make visible how image technologies invisibly manipulate our attention and perceptual gaze. And I also work with historical optical apparatus and instruments. And I guess I do that because sometimes they have more transparency in how they're actually generating the image. So I glean elements from these historical devices and bring them into my contemporary practice, which you'll see. So for Perceptual Illusions, I'm merging two strands of my practice together. I'm extending my exploration of illusionary depth of field in projected images, where I was playing with focal planes and 3D printed objects within my optical systems to create images of light that have this illusionary perspective and read like empty architectural spaces. But because they are images of light, in themselves, they have no materiality. And so once I turn off my light source, the space of the image disappears. And for the Uncertain Times project, I was interested in taking this further to see if I could generate a moving image with depth of field. So I'm experimentally merging this exploration with another part of my work, which explores this idea of optical mechanics, and just explain that. So traditionally in the history of moving image production, the illusion of movement involves some form of mechanically produced motion. But with optical mechanics, the illusionary moving image is created through the movement of reflected and refracted light. So extending a previous work, Ghost in the Machine, which was based on a 19th century animation apparatus by the artist and engineer Charles-Émile Renaud, I'm bringing in depth of field into this system to see if I can animate it, or at least create this illusion of a moving image that has a three-dimensional aesthetic. So my specific process revolves around optics and digital fabrication. So these are the two key ways in which I create the material components for my systems. So, and on this project, I've collaborated with microengineers Mark Sherrill and Siddhartha Saji at the Australian National Fabrication Facility, so to produce these bespoke mirrored components. So the mirrors were made using a process of micro-milling aluminium using a diamond fly cutting tool. And so these polygon mirrors, they rotate within the optical systems of light and lenses to activate this process of optical mechanics I've referred to. And then this in turn allows the viewer to perceive a projected moving image. And another significant part of the experimentation in my project has been the development of a series of small-scale optical components. So to investigate ways of producing depth of field in the overall image system. And these small objects, they're only about maybe 25 mil high by 15 mil wide. So they sit in between a series of mirrors, lenses, and the light source. And then when it's all these elements are combined together, that's how the projected image is produced. So throughout the project, I went through many iterations of these optical objects, which I digitally modeled and then printed using a resin printer. And for these objects, I was really using my background as a glassmaker to really understand how light engages with either the opacity or the translucency of the material. And it was also through iteration that I learned that the form of the components, in order to achieve this certain depth of field in the image, was also dependent upon the specific technology of the printer, of the actual resin it was using, and even to things like how the printer was actually forming the object. So how it was laying down the material in one direction as opposed to another. So these details dramatically changed the optical quality of the components and consequently the image that they were generating. And so that led me to think about how optical objects, how they are made, affects our perceptual experience of the image. And I think that's true for a lot of visual experience of images throughout time, throughout the centuries. For example, the way in which lenses are made over time has dramatically changed. And as a consequence, the aesthetics of the image and our perceptual experience of the image has changed. So it's like each era has a kind of optical visuality, I guess. And so where it's not just the technological system itself that's determining our perceptual experience, but it's actually how the material components of those technologies are made that also is very important. And I think today that sometimes we think, because we're in this digital era, that it's non-material. But in fact, the digital is highly dependent upon the material substrate. It's dramatically reduced in scale. So we're down to this kind of micro and nano level. But the material substrate is increasingly produced digitally. And so I think that's why I'm very interested in our current era of digital materiality, where the way in which things are made visually really affects our contemporary perception of images. So my iterative process, it also navigates different uses of different types of lenses. So when it's possible, I try to use historical magic lantern lenses, so late 19th century lenses or early 20th century. And again, that's down to the materiality, because the glass in those lenses produces a really beautiful image light. But each lens I use has a different focal system. And so that means that my optical components interact with each lens quite differently. So for example, I tested my 3D printed components in the photonics lab with a certain lens system. But when I brought the same component into my overall system, which also included the mirrors, it meant that the optical conditions had changed. And so I had to modify the components to adapt to this new scenario. And this resulted me in having to kind of turn the carousel and the components inside out. So you can see here in this image that I have the components facing outwards. So I have to flip them inside the carousel, which meant altering the scale of the components and redesigning them, because as you'll appreciate, as the carousel, as you move to the center point, the diameter decreases. But I guess I'm just sharing this to show you, or to illustrate how this Uncertain Times project, for me, there was this constant feedback loop between testing, looking, altering, testing again. And I was never really quite sure, where my iterations were going to take me or what they were going to produce in terms of the image. So throughout the project, I've also been really lucky to have had access to an optical bench in Dr. Dale Otten and Professor David Lancaster's photonics lab at UniSA, where I could really closely look at the results of my optical experiments. And this was the first time that I was able to change things so subtly in my objects and then really look at the differences of the effects that was producing in my projected images. So I could just spend time looking and noting what was working, what wasn't working with the images. And I really enjoy working in this environment because there's been a lot of informal conversation with Dale and David. For example, I'd be looking at the image in a certain way, and then they would come along and offer a completely different perspective. But then over time, I noticed how just through casual conversation, there was a kind of perceptual kind of emergence was taking place, where each of us at the beginning, so the artists and the scientists, we had quite different and distinct viewpoints. But now we have a more kind of entangled way of kind of looking at the images. So it's not like we're looking at it in the same way, but it's like our vision or appreciation of the image has been expanded in some way. So when my components are at a stage where they can be placed within the overall system, that's when I move the work to a visualization lab at the Research Center for Interactive and Virtual Environments at UniSA. So that's when I test the overall work. And to be honest, there's a lot of failure at this part of my process rather than success. But I tend to look at failure as the writer Toni Morrison did when she said that failure is just another form of information. So, you know, I here at this stage of the process, I let the work speak back to me. So when I'm able to listen to it as well as see it, I can figure out, you know, where I need to recalibrate, readjust in order to move it closer to where I want it to be. So it's like a dialogue between intended and realized outcomes for me. And I guess in this, you know, in my process, those two things are very rarely the same thing. So my process is very much driven by uncertainty, by not knowing, and then seeing what happens with my images when I undertake a certain action. So as mentioned at the beginning, so I'm still working on perceptual illusions. So I can't share at this stage the moving images of life, but as they say, watch this space, particularly if you're going to be in Adelaide in the next few weeks, where I'll be installing these works and their moving images as part of the project exhibition coming up at New March Gallery. So that involves all of the artists who spoke here today. And for those of you who can't make it as well, I'll be posting documented video documentation of the devices online. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Deirdre. So cool to think about perception from a sort of biological, philosophical point, but also see the materiality of those images. Thank you so much to each of the four artists. We're now moving into some time for conversation. So as I mentioned before, we've got some pre-submitted questions that we'll start with, and then we've got the chat where you can start putting anything else in that you'd like to get to. I'll start by addressing this first question to all of you, to each of the artists. This comes from Harriet. The question is, it's a little bit longer. I'll read out the whole comment. I've been uncertain about the ability of creative practices to decenter human questions and needs and develop work where culture and nature are entangled, where ideas and practices are one and the same. In this field, where work is often created to be seen or heard in a gallery context, what can interspecies dialogue, embodied and/or land-based practices come in? I might shorten it for you. It might be, so when we're decentering human questions and needs, where culture and nature are entangled, when the work that we're thinking about now is presented in a gallery context, how can interspecies dialogue and embodied and land-based practice, how does that inform all of these questions? Maybe we'll start with you, Brad.
Yeah, sure. Look, I think that's a really interesting question in regards to, you know, the broader, I guess, context of a museum or gallery and how that shifts things inherently when they're represented in those spaces. Like if you take, for example, objects from religious contexts that are removed from their location, their site-specific kind of location where they were intended to be presented or used initially, what they were made for, and then you place them in a museum context or a gallery context or whatever, you know, in a different country, in a different social and political context, in a different time, you know, these things inherently affect, you know, how a museum or gallery repositions and represents something. So for me, that question kind of, you know, it leads to that idea. And I think that these kind of human-centered values that I noticed were posed in one of the other questions around AI and ethics, you know, all of that sort of stuff also feeds into that question around decentering the human need or question, and bringing culture and nature back into those spaces. It's like, it's a tricky one to to answer, but I think it's a worthy question, you know, to give like it's rich kind of grounds for conversation, and I'd be keen to hear, you know, what other people have to say about that as well. But that's kind of that's my sort of like I guess lead in for the conversation in regards to that question.
How about you, Catherine?
Thank you for asking. Such an interesting question, and so wonderful to hear Brad's point of view. I've been thinking about that a lot because in my process, you know, I'm kind of up to 45 years full-time practice, and I'm constantly reviewing my own process as an artist. What's my role? Am I an arts activist? Are we all activists? And I actually feel more and more that we are, that we have a really interesting platform of creative response. And in that, in the very makeup, in the material of our responses, is how we can communicate that to across generations and across wide kind of oceans of difference. And this particular project has opened that up in very interesting ways for me in particular. It's stripped back my language. It's stripped back my entire approach to process in the sense of I feel like I hopefully am heading towards decentralizing my role as the core of how I communicate. What it feels like is that I've come to a point where there has to be a different way of listening. I mean, I have to go right back to the beginning. There has to be a different way of even looking at things, of being in places that are challenging. For instance, my project has thrown me into very challenging environments that I didn't know were quite so challenging until I looked very carefully from other points of view, not just my own as an artist, but asking others to be there with me, to teach me more about what I'm looking at and the potential of what I'm looking at in terms of how I can be involved in asking people to step back even further in their observation of the natural world. I feel like the essence of our work is to make it more accessible to broader audiences. And I think that's absolutely key in terms of our communication as artists, to decentralize ourselves even as observers. It's a fascinating, I don't have any answers. I feel like I'm just going through a process of identifying the great gaps in how we communicate our work.
Nikki, this is very much the realm of your work, I think, the entanglement of human, non-human. What was the term that you used? What was biological? Oh, and you're mute, just on mute.
Okay. When you work with living organisms, you see that they react in different ways, different to us, and you try and develop an understanding of them. So you ask questions of the work, you know, and you try and think of other viewpoints. What does this mean ethically when I manipulate something? How we observe these things and how we translate them into a gallery, it's difficult. Usually these things are documentations of what we've been working on, but the spirit or the life force of taking something from, I'll use the word loosely, a natural environment into something quite technical shifts. So you can't have the same experience that you would have let's say, in an environment in a gallery space. Also, when things are presented, I agree with Brad, they take on an ethnographic layer, and then the way they're presented speaks as well. I made a work called Ethnographica one time where I also noticed that things that had a function outside in the world had a total shift of function once they came into a gallery or a place in which they were presented. As far as artists being activists, that is, we can bring a voice into a gallery. And we can, I think all we can do is try and speak as mindfully as we can and to try and consider other voices. But yes, it's difficult. I agree.
Deirdre, I think you were the one who used the word entangled as well.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously my presentation, I wasn't engaging with nature, but in terms of technology and this kind of non-hierarchical kind of human, non-human, you know, how we engage with each other, I think that the senses, and Catherine, you alluded to this, you know, in your response as well, I think the portal, or the way in which we can, it's like the interface, how we can engage or kind of communicate or share from the human to non-human is through our senses, because I think we do need to embrace that we are human, but then how does that enable us to communicate in this non-hierarchical way? And for me, I think that's where, you know, part of my interest lies in technology, because the technology, I think technology has become to be this really, you know, dirty word almost, that it separates us from nature. But I think initially the original meaning of the word techne is to bring us closer to our own kind of human nature and the world. So for example, this idea of the lens, what the lens does, it brings certain elements of nature that are invisible to the unmediated eye visible. So I think we can engage with the senses and the technology to actually deepen our connection and again, kind of remove this hierarchical structure that we seem to have. And for me as well, so I'm really interested in the aspect of non-human in terms of materiality. So for example, I see that the lens sees, and I see the lens is seeing, and that's what I see. So, and again, this notion of, a lot of my work is about a kind of material thinking. So not, yeah, just thinking through ideas, through, you know, creating material objects and systems. And I think having that openness also will help us engage, you know, across the human, this kind of, I don't know, like kind of, it's almost like an illusionary boundary, because we are all interconnected, as all the artists have also, you know, mentioned. And then it's just, how do you keep that open so that the kind of the barriers or those false kind of structures don't go up and kind of cause, you know, and cause kind of destruction.
Mm-hmm.
Brad mentioned AI, and we did have a question about AI, so I might put that to all of you as well. So the question came from Cara Ann, and it's, how do you manage or address the uncertainty of maintaining your arts practice? Oh, sorry, there's two questions. The second question, which I'll now read, is what are your thoughts on the uncertainty surrounding new AI and AI-related technologies, i.e. uncertain laws, ethics, integrity? And where do you draw the line between AI and not AI?
I'm not sure whether we'll come to a place where we can define the difference. I feel that we're there already. That it's difficult to sometimes define the difference between AI and not AI. And you know, I keep on coming back to this sense of kind of, you have to really believe in your own powers of judgment as to what feels morally right and what doesn't. If we shift from that, except from learning to be more open, of course, but if we shift from that, then we have really torn the fabric of who we are, I think, just from a very personal point of view. I feel like there are a lot of choices to be made. As an artist, I'm very mindful of looking after the land that I'm on and thinking way beyond my own lifespan in that thinking and expressing my views through that kind of thinking. I don't know how we define the truth in the future. That, I guess that's the big question, isn't it? What are you expressing? What do you think is right and wrong? That's simple and that profound, I think. They're the big questions that are coming up with the development of artificial intelligence. I think the basic premise that we're creative entities is also something that we individually have to investigate. What does that bring to the world particularly when we think of crossing over our knowledge bases, of giving almost looking at the tenets of the tradition of what we do as artists, even down to the materiality of it, questioning that and opening it up to difference, even the artificial, really, how that's going to be, how do we make judgments? I guess I'm throwing out lots of questions here. And artists are in a prime spot, really, to express that uncertainty, to question it. I'm interested in other people's opinion on that.
I think that so, you know, this notion of AI and, you know, as a kind of technological tool, and I think there's just it's a real juncture, because up to now technology has been, you know, the prosthesis. It's something that's helped the human extend their sensory capability or their cognitive capability. It's, yeah, then this idea of the tool, but now what it's done is it inverts it. So we are now the fodder for computer intelligence. We are now the, you know, the more of our information that we upload online, the more they gobble it up and, you know, become more intelligent. And I use the word in inverted commas. And I also think what's happened through this is the wording of artificial intelligence is now a misnomer, because I don't think it's artificial anymore. I think it's here, it's real, it's part of who we are. And this, it's just, and I think, again, this word artificial it puts a kind of othering that we're better than the computer. It's just, we're different. I think it's just a more expanded. I think that if we embrace it or look at it differently, and then how can we, you know, there's conversations that, you know, this idea of AI is it's the end of us, you know, we're doomed and it's just gonna like take over. But I think perhaps it's more about re-understanding our, you know, our position, I guess, and or maybe perhaps renegotiating our position, and then, you know, thinking about how we do that. And maybe that could help us then also look at how we think about humans in relation to nature and the environment. And so perhaps it'll kind of give us help us develop a new perspective, perhaps a more expanded perspective, and I guess decenter the human point of view.
And I also say, like Deirdre, you know, just on that point of the word artificial, you know, and artificial intelligence being a term that's been used for a long time to describe something that I don't feel is necessarily the best way to describe it. I think that you're right in that regard, but I would go further and say that the term artificial, you know, arguably has been incorrect the whole time, because, you know, we need to, I think, we need to question ideas around what it is that artificial intelligence is. Like, it's, to me, a reflection of humanity. It's us, I think, Catherine, you might have mentioned before all about artificial intelligence or machines or whatever being an extension of our, ourselves as artists. These kind of like tools that we create, they're developed within specific contexts, and those contexts, have specific standpoints. So, what worldview has that been developed in? But today, what we're looking at is a universal systems, developed in particular contexts by people, by humans with social and political contexts and backgrounds that they're bringing their own selves and their own experiences of the world into these systems, and they're collecting data, but we're collecting data. Like, it's us that's collecting the data. It's not them. It's us, but it's us in different contexts. When it's a universal thing that's spanning the internet, it's across all of the entire globe. So for me, the ethical framework raises like questions, like for example, we have an ethical standpoint put forward by governing bodies, governments, and organizations in Australia. There are guiding principles, and in those guiding principles, they're human-centered values that we're applying to AI systems. But I think where we start to like diverge from that is when we're talking about like sentience in AI, artificial general intelligence. Questions immediately arise, like, how can a universal human ideological standpoint be applied to AI systems if those AI systems are sentient? Can this type of approach still be considered ethical in that context if that system becomes sentient? That's when it diverges. But for me, these are very much like reflections of us as people, as humans in social and political contexts.
I think there's always been worry associated with new technologies, cutting edge technologies. I think it's because of the lag between understanding of the technology itself and future applications which haven't been decided as the technology becomes available. And it's only as we work with these technologies do we actually are the implications of them actually revealed. So I think whatever new technology there has been released, there's always been this unknown area that troubles people. I remember reading that people were afraid to ride on a train back in the day because they couldn't ever imagine themselves moving so fast. I actually think that as technology evolved with generations, they just find that that's just their new normal. That's just life of contemporary life, and they just become part of the mainstream. But I do think there is always this unsettled period between technology and the understanding of where it's going to take us. I actually think that it's exciting that we have this extended brain of artificial intelligence. I'm not scared that it's going to become this thing that we can't control. After all, we're the ones that are putting the data into it. Perhaps we're afraid of that our mind can't contemplate the vast extent of what it can hold as compared to a human brain. But I think AI is very exciting. I do agree with Catherine, though, about this idea of truth, and that truth is something that's going to be very elastic, because I looked myself up on a new platform and it said that I was born in 1949. So my collaborator Pung and I had a bit of a conversation that in the future I'll be arguing with the computer as to what's the real truth. But is the computer correct, or is my organic self truth on what is truth in the future? So, but yeah, there'll be many questions that more questions than we can understand at the moment that will evolve about AI, I think. But I'm excited.
I'd like to ask this question that's come from Jen. While we're on a sort of social political tangent, is the uncertainty of creative practice anti-capitalist?
Brad, that's up your alley.
Everything I do is anti-capitalist, Jen. Nah, that's not true. Unfortunately. I think that, yeah, there is, I mean, capitalism to me is uncertainty. To engage in an ideology and system that is purely transactional and extractive is inherently uncertain. So, you know, where are we going in this neo-capitalist context? We're going nowhere, and we're going nowhere pretty fast. And it's arguably, you know, our demise in a number of ways when you look at climate change and the chasm of inequality between people at the bottom and the top in our social structures. I think that there are a number of other issues that we could touch on, but capitalism is really driving, like, or neo-capitalism. It's not capitalism. It's not capitalism at all. Pure capitalism. It's far removed from that. It's still very much a transactional and extractive mindset. So for me, to get to an anti-capitalist standpoint, I think creativity, you know, it's a part of that, but it's going back to that standpoint, you know, that Kalani Carlson, a researcher from Hawaii, talks about studying blue carbon and seaweed. I recently went to a seaweed conference in Hobart, and this presentation by Andrew Kalani Carlson really stuck out because he's talking about what is his standpoint, you know, as a Hawaiian conducting research overseas in Japan, you know, on unceded lands of Ainu people who don't have sovereignty over their lands, you know. And for him, his research either perpetuates colonization or it disrupts colonization. There's no middle ground. And I think that can be said for pretty much everything, I feel. You know, what you're doing and how you're interacting with your world and the people in it is either perpetuating that mindset or is disrupting it. And if we're looking at disrupting it, what does that mean? Well, it means that we're not focused on those transactional, extractive standpoints, where we're shifting and we're recentering a more holistic environment, our world, the land, you know, and the waters that we're a part of, back to the center of that. And so you know, you have to be creative in some respects to do that. But yeah, I think what I'm trying to say is to bring everything back into that balance. We need to be, you know, there is no post-colonial. We are in a colonized world that is continually colonizing, and unless we're exploring new ways of existing that are not, you know, following that same path that we've been on, that are anti-capitalist, you know, we need to, yeah, times will remain uncertain.
Absolutely. We have mere minutes until the webinar will, I don't know what happens when we hit 2 o'clock. Something might happen. I might just put a final question in the last little bit of time that we have to anyone who wants to jump in. This is a part of a question from Laura. She says that Donna Haraway talks of staying with the trouble. What does this look like within creative practice? And really, so how can we honor the uncomfortable and the unknown and the uncertain?
Well, just from experience, from working with a lot of scientists, and it's been touched upon by Deirdre in particular, it's embracing chaos and then embracing failure is kind of pivotal to expanding knowledge. That's all I'll say. I've learned that, like, from personal experience, that it is one of the most enriching prime movers of knowledge, and not holding on to your knowledge as being an end point. It's only the beginning. If you think you know something, it's only the beginning. It's not a full stop.
Now, very quickly, just jump in there and just say that actually, I really love that question, because this whole project, A Partnership for Uncertain Times, is about meeting the uncomfortable gaze of uncertainty. It's about dwelling in that space when, you know, we don't know what's going to happen. We don't, you know, so sitting with being uncomfortable with things. And I think for me, anyway, my part of the project, that's what has generated. That's what has pushed and driven the project forward. It's the, yeah, meeting that in the eye, and then, you know, moving within that space itself.
Any final thoughts, Nikki?
Staying with the trouble is about being responsible. Make your artwork reflect the times that you live in. Be mindful. Question. Don't stop working. You know, give a voice. Artists can be activists.
That's right.
So make your mark.
Absolutely.
Keep your hands on the work. That's right.
Keep your hands on the work. Yes.
Keep your hands on the work.
Beautiful. We are now sadly out of time, but thank you so much to each of you, to Brad DARKSON, Catherine Truman, Deirdre Feeney, NIKI SPEROU. Wonderful to see what you've been working on, to hear your thought in relation to all of this. I feel we've covered so much ground. For anyone who would like to stay in touch with these projects, with the artists, you can follow everything on the ANAT website. There's the ANAT Digest News. There will be the exhibition coming up at the Newmarch Gallery in Prospect on the 16th, from the 16th of June. So do come along to that and see it. And there will be the online catalogue up in the meantime. Thanks again to all of the artists, to ANAT, to UniSA, and of course to Arts SA for funding the project. And thank you all of you for tuning in and sending in your questions, for making a really wonderful, rich discussion. Thanks so much to all of you. Take care. We'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.